Everyone looks forward to a review of an Albion sword, except for me. It's actually kind of boring to talk about Albion swords because I can't criticize anything. Albion is a well-known and respected brand because they make some of the best swords you can buy out there, especially at the price point. So, what do? Well, I very often just talk about the sword typology and how well implemented it is and how well it performs, because of course it does. It's an Albion sword. Sometimes, though, every once in a while, there's something I can criticize. It's not really always a direct criticism of Albion because, again, they're going to make a really good sword. But let's see what I have to say as I take a look at this sword, the Albion Regent. As armor developed in the late Middle Ages to better protect knights from the new dangers on the battlefield, the more well-established weapons that had become hallmarks of the quintessential warrior struggled to keep up. As the Middle Ages came to a close, armor was primarily focused on the threats of crossbows and guns, as protection from most of the melee combat had already been accounted for. The sword changed its primary focus twice in this arms race, starting as the primary cutting weapons so common in the early to high Middle Ages, and becoming more thrust-oriented as plate armor developed. However, sword designs did not abandon the need for effective cuts, and many of the latest period swords had design elements that focused on a fine balance of effective thrusts and devastating cutting potential. The Oakshot Type 18B is the quintessential example of balancing these fundamental uses of a sword for the late medieval and early Renaissance period longswords. The blade profile reaching a near perfect balance in use. Its primary design is a long tapered blade coming to an acute point with a hollow ground cross-section providing a central ridge that keeps the blade rigid in the thrust while simultaneously providing a refined cutting edge and a light weight for swift movement. The Albion Regent is a classic example of the Oakshot Type 18B. Inspired by the beautiful longswords favored in areas of Germanic influence during the mid to late 15th century, it combines efficient width at the cutting section with a strong, awl-shaped point. The grip is of hexagonal section and has the typical waisted profile. Its hilt is inspired by that on a sword found in the Bodensee Sea, dated to the mid-15th century and is kept at the Landesmuseum in Zurich. The pommel is of Type 5, a flamboyant version of the fishtail style. The cross is slim with an octagonal section and clubbed ends that can be classified as a version of Cross Style 2 according to the Oakshot system. Albion's goal for this design? A quick, responsive, and efficient cutter with a forward pivot point placed close to the point. A hollow ground blade can have a thick and stiff spine and still be relatively light for its size. This is an important aspect of this design. A limited edition handcrafted collectible sword, the Albion Regent is offered in a limited edition of only 1,000 collectible swords worldwide. The Regent is also available with a period half-wire wrap at an additional charge. Albion makes beautiful swords. From an aesthetic standpoint, I've always used the terms kind of simple elegance. That is, they don't over-embellish in a way that detracts from the profile, the look of the sword, but yet have all the detailing in place that it doesn't just look plain and boring. And I think the Regent holds up to that perfectly well. This is actually a sword design that, in terms of hilt design, is not necessarily my favorite, but it is quite the beauty. And it really begins to really suck me into its design, and I really begin to appreciate it more. And the Type 18B Longsword is, well, it's such a difficult sword to make, to build, in terms of all that goes into it, the blade profile, that when you see it implemented correctly, you begin to realize just how amazing of a sword it really is, not just in the aesthetics, but of course in the function. And there is a reason why I very often say that this style of sword, the 18B, is basically that quintessential longsword. I've done a review of an Albion Regent before, and I talk about how it is kind of the classic longsword, but this one really has that perfect balance of everything. And the implementation that Albion did for the Regent is as close to flawless as you can get. So I want to walk through the aesthetic features of this sword from tip to pommel and just talk about how they did their implementation and why I think this is such a grand sword, why it's such a beautiful sword. But then I really want to speak about the functionality of it, because my goodness, is this a wonderful sword to actually use. So let's start right down here at the tip. Everything on the implementation of this blade, from the tip right down to the cross, is incredibly well implemented. There is an obvious secondary bevel because this is sharpened, and I did confirm that this is a sharpening job that was done by Albion. So the secondary bevel is not done by anybody else. This is Albion's job to actually bring it to a very, very, very fine sharpness, and it is an extremely sharp sword. And with the central ridge and with a hollow grind, this is one of those blade profiles that for things to be perfectly even can be very difficult to do. Now, it's no secret that Albion uses a CNC mill to at least make the basic profile of the blade, but they do actually hand grind a lot of the other elements to it. And a hollow grind is very difficult to keep very even, and it's a very even hollow grind. No flaws that I can see in it. Where this blade meets the crossguard, there's also no real visible gaps, and I mean like really large gaps. Now there is some. This is actually probably the largest gap I've ever seen in an Albion sword at the cross. That would actually be one of the few criticisms I could do on the actual implementation of the sword as it's designed, is that there is that little bit of a space in between, but it's not impacting the kind of fit and finish of it really at all, and you don't really notice it unless you're being really, really critical. The cross itself is quite nice. I really like the octagonal shape. I like what they've done with it. They've done similar shapes on some other crossguard designs. Again, the simplicity here holds, but they've done some nice detailing work to make it have a little bit more of a flair, stand out a bit, while remaining very, very simple. The grip is one of the more interesting features of this sword because it's an octagonal grip that visually gives it a little bit of a different look. And because of how this grip was actually implemented, they don't do the cord wrapping around the leather, which means that you don't have the patterning on the leather that you tend to have on some of the other Albion swords. So it's a very, very soft, even leather application. It looks really nice. The octagonal thing kind of catches the eye, especially when you have multiple lights at different angles. If I were to hold up this sword like so, you can actually see that you have a little bit of dark and a little bit of light, and you actually get it to catch the light in a little bit of a different manner than you would if it was just kind of an oval shaped grip. And the wire wrapping that they've done, they have some little rivet pieces tacked down, and they have the wire wrap. This is the wire wrap version. It usually costs a little bit more, and it's a nice job. It's very even. It's on there. It looks good. Not necessarily my own personal preference. Wire wrapping is actually something that a lot of people like. I'm not the biggest fan of it, but I think it actually works really well for this sword with that kind of quasi-Germanic Gothic appearance to it. I think it actually somehow fits it a lot better, and I think if you were to get this sword without the wire wrap, you'd enjoy it, you'd like the sword, but somehow it speaks to the overall design a little bit better when it has that wire wrapping. I don't really know what it is, but it might be one of the few times I can actually appreciate a wire wrapping. And then the pommel is one of the more unique, interesting looks. Very, very strange looking pommel. This is the type of pommel that you wouldn't try to actually grip and use like most people would think about, because it would really kind of dig into your hand. There is something to be said for the ability to put your fingers into the design of this and actually be able to grip it with fingers, but I very much like to palm my pommel if I'm going into a thrust. But visually, this is one of those really complex designs. It's very, very hard to do as a good finish, and I think Albion did just an absolutely wonderful job with it. There is no obvious peen mark, which makes me really wonder exactly how this has been implemented. I am fairly certain this is actually peened somehow and then has been ground down. Albion does like to do a grind over their peens, and you really, I mean, you don't even really see an obvious peen even on a peen block. And a lot of their swords, they do a really good job of profiling it down. So wherever the peen is, I can't even see it. I guess it's possible they've implemented it some other way, but as far as I know, as far as I'm aware, Albion only really does peens. So if anyone has any knowledge about that, certainly put a comment in this video so I can double check that. Overall, I think the aesthetics of this sword are, while not normally something I would go for, that kind of, again, Germanic Gothic looking hilt assembly, it is quite striking and quite beautiful in its own right. And I think the Regent is one of those swords that when you see it online, it doesn't quite impress as much as it does when you see it in person. You're actually able to hold it and appreciate it. But where this sword really, really works is in its functionality. And this might be the first time I've ever used a sword, especially in something like a cut test, where I truly understood what it meant for something to become a natural extension of the arm. That phrase is used a lot with people who are practitioners who use swords. They say, oh, it's a natural, you treat the sword like it's a natural extension of the arm. And I've been doing a lot to get better at doing cuts just in general, and so when I'm going out and cutting the tatami mat, I'm able to do cuts better. And if you watch the footage of me doing the cuts, there's actually a moment, there's like an aha moment that I have after the second cut where I realize just how easy it was to cut with this sword, which I really didn't quite expect, even though I knew that it's supposed to be kind of the value of a hollow grind. But after that second cut, I was like, wow, this is so swift and easy to use that I started doing more rapid cuts. And so I'm certain that my form suffered out of my desire to just use it a little bit faster and have a little bit of fun with it. But the fact that it still worked in that moment of cuts that were swift and fast and weren't being done with a lot of forethought was really pretty cool and pretty nice to feel, because I don't know I've really ever felt that before. You know, all the elements of a sword like this really come down to its ability to cut. And I really say that because of the blade profile. With that hollow grind, the hollow grind is meant to strike that perfect balance between having that central ridge to really make sure that sword is going to work in a thrust and not have any real flex to it, but still maintains that nice, fine, refined edge so it cuts well. You know, it's more about the user of the sword, it always is, but the sword design really, really supports its ability to do a good cut. And Albion actually spoke to it in their product description, saying they're looking to get that forward pivot point to actually give it a good cutting profile. You can actually see what this kind of looks like in the dynamics graph that I built for this sword. It works. It has the same dynamics profile, I would say, as like the Albion Lichtenauer, which is their blunt longsword equivalent. It feels very similar to the Ringek in a lot of ways. It's definitely lighter than the Ringek, or at least feels a lot lighter. But the agility for it is about what you'd expect in a longsword, and somehow it seems to actually feel better than actually what the agility graph shows. It's actually also the first time I've ever noticed that, where I almost disagreed with the agility graph with this sword, but there's something about that feels really good in motion, and there's a lot to be said for that. Now, one of the criticisms I will actually have, it's actually kind of a twofold criticism, has to do with the grip. The first one is the octagonal grip, while it looks really nice, I don't think that it feels as good in the hand. It kind of bites into almost like pressure points in the hand, and And that's not so much to do with Albion's implementation, because I think their implementation is fine. It just has to do with the overall design. If they're going for an octagonal grip because that's what you see in a museum original, well, then they're implementing on a design that was actually out there. But I don't know that it's my personal preference. I think that it actually is painful to use barehanded. I actually think I'd be more happy with a glove on in this case. And then with the wire wrapping, I would actually then say that, again, I find wire wrappings to not provide me the grip that I actually enjoy. I actually feel like it gets a little bit slippery, especially if you get sweaty. I tried really hard to not get sweaty on this sword because it's not mine. It was being lent to me for the purpose of this review. But when your hand gets sweaty, it feels like it slips a bit. And so this almost feels like a sword that belongs in a gloved hand for those reasons. And they're minor gripes, but when you're talking about a sword that you would potentially use for long durations of time, it begins to matter a lot more. But I really do feel like that the functionality aspect of this sword is right where it needs to be. It's a supreme example of a Type 18B in implementation for aesthetics as well as implementation for functionality, and it's probably one of the best long swords I've ever used. And I really didn't expect to say that. When I knew that this sword was going to come, and I knew what the Regent looked like, I had some, I guess, preconceived notions about how I might feel about the sword. But all those are gone in the process of doing the cut test, in the process of just handling the sword and feeling what it's like, and understanding what makes this sword work and how it works. I really began to understand that this is truly a great example of a quintessential longsword, and it works so well for that purpose. Like I said in the intro to this review, what do I say about an Albion? I mean, really, they're so well implemented. They do such a good job on everything that it becomes very hard to actually have real criticism of their weapons. And if it wasn't for the fact that this was just such a wonderful sword to use, it was so much fun, it was so enjoyable, and that feeling of it being an extension of the arm, wow, just wow. It really does hold up to pretty much any type of criticism I could try to even throw at it. Albion has just done an amazing job with this design. Peter Johnson does a lot of their primary designs, their blade profiles, all that, but their implementation on his designs are just, I mean, near flawless. I really don't have many complaints about the actual implementation of the sword. It's the certain design choices like the octagonal grip that are my primary gripes, and even things like the half wire grip that I would think that I wouldn't like, I like in this sword, and that just, it speaks volumes of Albion as a company. But yeah, if you're looking to be one of the lucky 1,000 that gets to own an Albion Regent, I would highly suggest going ahead and saving up for it, because it is truly a wonderful longsword. I think at this point, this Type 18B is the next style sword I want to get from Albion. It may not be the Regent, but I definitely at this point want an 18B from Albion. It might be the Regent just because I like this one so much, but I'm probably going to go for one that has that oval handle, that oval grip, so it can be truly my perfect longsword, and maybe a slightly different pommel. But I'm really looking at that Type 18B with that hollow grind, with this rough implementation, the way the Albion Regent has been done. Because I can't think of higher praise for a sword. I really can't. Of all the swords I have ever reviewed on this channel, this is actually probably my favorite to use. It's not going to replace the Gallo Glass in terms of being my favorite sword of all time, because the aesthetics there are going to always win hands down for me. But in terms of being a longsword practitioner, where the Albion Gallo Glass is not really the longsword equivalent that I would really want for that purpose, this one truly is. And the fact that it comes from that kind of Germanic background means that it works really well for people who want to do that kind of Germanic longsword combat, or want to have an actual sharp functional version of that sword. Man, what a wonderful sword this is. It's a shame I can't keep it. I do have to send it back to its rightful owner, begrudgingly, but I will do it. But yes, this is truly a wonderful sword. And this is the Albion Regent Longsword, Type 18B. I hope you enjoyed this review. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. You can also check out Medieval Review on Patreon.